The dusty air clung to Leona's lungs, thick with the scent of dried horse sweat and unspoken judgment. She stood, small and trembling, on the makeshift platform, her gaze fixed on the scuffed boots of the men below. Each breath was a shallow prayer that this nightmare would end, that the earth might simply swallow her whole. Her father, a man whose kindness had long since turned to bitterness, had left her no choice, leaving only debts and the chilling silence of abandonment. The auctioneer's voice, a harsh rattle, boomed over the murmuring crowd, each word a hammer blow against her already fractured spirit. She was 19, a Lakota girl, sold like cattle to the highest bidder. The shame burned through her veins, a fire no tears could douse. What was left of her dignity crumbled with every raised hand. She felt the weight of every eye, every whisper, condemning her before they even knew her name. This was the end of everything she knew, or perhaps the end of her entirely. Despair was a cold, constant companion now. The bidding ceased, an abrupt silence falling. Leona braced herself for the expected, for the rough hand, the demanding voice. Instead, a tall man, broad-shouldered and weathered, stepped forward. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, met hers without pity or malice, only a strange, unsettling calm. He looked like the land he came from, harsh, unyielding, yet holding a quiet strength. The auctioneer cleared his throat, announcing the sum, a figure that made Leona's stomach lurch. Then, the rancher spoke, his voice surprisingly soft, a rumble in the vast quiet. "Ma'am," he said, his gaze unwavering, "I bought you for $60, but I need to ask your permission. Will you marry me before sundown?" The words hung in the air, a bewildering twist in her desolate fate. She didn't look back at the gaping faces, the shock visible even on their hardened features. The choice was not a choice at all. Not truly. It was a desperate grasp at the last sliver of something that resembled safety. They rode in silence, the dust from his horse's hooves trailing behind them like a ghost. Leona sat stiffly beside him in the wagon, the coarse fabric of her dress scratching against her skin. The wedding, if it could be called that, had been brief. The justice of the peace, a man with kind eyes but a practiced, distant tone. She was now Caleb Thorne's wife, a name that felt foreign on her tongue, an identity she couldn't comprehend. The sun dipped low, painting the vast plains in hues of orange and violet, a stark beauty she barely noticed. Her mind reeled with questions she dared not ask. What kind of man buys a woman? What did he expect from her? Her past, a tangle of betrayals and unmet needs, screamed its warnings. Trust was a word she had no use for, a concept that had only brought her pain. He was an enigma, a man who paid for her freedom, then bound her to him with a quick, legal knot. Uncertainty was a heavy cloak around her. His ranch was a collection of sturdy, unadorned buildings, huddled against the vast expanse of the prairie. The main house, humble but well-kept, loomed in the fading light. He led her inside, the scent of wood smoke and old leather filling the air. He showed her a small, clean room, a simple bed with a patched quilt, a basin of fresh water. "This is yours," he said, his voice flat, devoid of demand. "There's food on the stove when you're ready." He left her then, retreating to the other side of the house. No touches, no expectations, just a quiet space given. It was not what she anticipated. The silence of the house was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. She felt a strange dissonance, the harshness of her new reality, clashing with the unexpected decency he showed. A tentative connection, a thread so thin it might break with a breath, began to form. Days turned into weeks, marked by the rhythms of ranch life. Leona woke before dawn, helped with the simple chores, her movements stiff, her eyes always watchful. Caleb worked tirelessly, his hands calloused, his back bent with effort. He never raised his voice, never looked at her with anything but that quiet, unreadable gaze. He brought her wild prairie flowers once, leaving them on her bedside table, a silent offering. Her father's constant demands, his unpredictable rages, had left their own kind of scars, deep and invisible. She saw the fresh marks on Caleb's hands from mending fences, a stark contrast to the emotional wounds she carried. He didn't press her with questions, didn't try to force conversation. She began to notice the way his eyes would soften when he spoke to his horses, or how he'd pause just to listen to the wind. These small gestures, Small kindnesses chipped away at her fear, revealing the raw edges of her own burden. One evening, as the first snowflakes danced outside the window, Caleb spoke of his own past, not in a plea for sympathy, but as a quiet statement of fact. His family had lost everything in the war, his mother and sister to illness, leaving him alone with the land and the weight of inherited debt. He didn't mention the auction, didn't justify his actions, but Leona understood now. He had seen desperation, known the feeling of being unwanted, perhaps even bought her not for ownership, but for preservation. She, in turn, found herself sharing fragments of her own story, the cold emptiness after her mother's death, the slow decline of her father's farm, the final humiliating act of selling her. It was a difficult conversation, laced with long silences and the heavy weight of unspoken pain. But as the words hung between them, a fragile sense of belonging began to settle, born not of affection, but of shared understanding and a silent acknowledgement of their mutual burdens. The winter storm arrived with a vengeance, trapping them on the ranch. It was a physical manifestation of the isolation they already felt, and it brought with it another kind of threat. The snow piled high, cutting off the roads, and with it came the sheriff, bundled against the cold, his face grim. He spoke of rumors, of a young Lakota girl missing from the reservation, of questions being asked. Leona felt a surge of panic, the fragile safety she had found threatening to shatter. Would Caleb hand her over? Was this brief respite truly just a facade? The sheriff's eyes, cold and assessing, seemed to strip away the thin veneer of her new life, exposing her as a fraud. Caleb stood firm, his voice level, explaining the marriage, showing the papers, a quiet defiance in his posture. He defended her, not with boasts, but with simple truths. The storm raged outside, but the storm within Leona was far more terrifying, the fear of losing this tentative belonging. The sheriff left, his questions unanswered, but his suspicions clearly not fully assuaged. The storm continued its brutal assault on the ranch, testing the strength of their home and their newfound bond. One night, as the wind howled like a hungry wolf, a weakened calf needed attention. Caleb was exhausted, his face etched with worry. Without a word, Leona went to the barn, her hands clumsy at first, learning to help him. She remembered the warmth of her mother's hands, how she had always known what to do for the sick and weak. As they worked side by side, a quiet understanding passed between them. The fear of external judgment faded, replaced by the immediate need to protect what was theirs. Even this small, vulnerable creature. Caleb looked at her, his eyes holding a depth of trust she had never seen before. She chose to stay, to fight for this life, not for freedom, but for a connection that felt more real than anything she had ever known. The storm eventually broke, leaving behind a world hushed and pristine under a blanket of snow. The land, once unforgiving, now seemed to hold a promise of renewal. The threat had passed, leaving them bruised but unbroken. Leona found herself looking at Caleb not as her owner, nor merely her husband, but as her partner. The scars of her past remained, etched into her memory, but they no longer defined her. She wasn't broken, she realized, just bent. He had seen her desperation, her shame, and offered her something unexpected: kindness. She began to speak more freely, sharing thoughts, even small dreams she hadn't dared to articulate before. He listened, his quiet presence a steady anchor. Their life was not one of grand gestures, but of shared silences, of understanding glances, of the quiet affirmation that they were in this together. Spring arrived, melting the snow and revealing the green shoots of new life. The ranch hummed with activity, the land slowly waking. Leona learned to ride, her movements growing surer each day, a sense of belonging rooting itself deep within her. The quiet wins of their life together were small but profound. A shared laugh over a clumsy mistake, the peace of watching the sunset from the porch, the growing warmth that settled between them. The past, with its bitter taste of abandonment and being unwanted, was not forgotten, but it no longer held absolute sway. Her journey was not a heroic triumph, but a quiet, tenacious act of choosing to stay, of sacrificing the idea of escape for the reality of family. The harsh landscape of the prairie, much like their lives, softened with the changing seasons, holding both the burden of memory and the quiet promise of healing. Peace, she found, was not the absence of scars, but the embrace of a future built on quiet trust and unexpected kindness.